Hi all, thank you so much for joining us this morning for our part 2 of our version 1.0 release launch of the data request. Just a quick note that this meeting is being recorded, so if you don't want to appear in the recording, please keep your video off. We will have chance for questions and discussion at multiple points during the session, and during those sessions you can either pop your hand up on WebEx, or we'll also have a Slido that we'll share where you can type your questions out. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Chloe, who'll do the first presentation for us this morning.
Beth. Hi everyone, thanks for coming. How many people got online? Okay, nice. I'll start by just sort of mentioning that this is our version 1.0 launch for the data request. So this is our first major release for the data request, and we're super excited to bring it to you and sort of talk to you a bit about it. Let's go to the next slide. So what we're going to cover today, I'm going to do a bit of an overview of the data request structure, some of the context, some of the details, just sort of a brief overview of everything. I'll pass over to Martin, who's going to compare some of the differences between CMIP 6 and CMIP 7, so what are the major changes. And James, our third co-lead, is going to talk about what software is available to support using the data request and some future engagement plans. Yep, let's go. Next slide. So you may have seen this already, but just to kind of reiterate the point, early in the process of designing the data request, we designed a strategic approach where we split the data request into 3 different components. A core component, which is an all-purpose set of about 135 variables that can be used across WCRP activities. It's sort of a general purpose list of key variables to analyze and evaluate climate models. So that kind of underpins the data request. It really provides a foundation that will be those 135 variables requested from every experiment. The next level up is what we call the harmonized layer. This is kind of the bulky section that maps variables onto fast track experiments in particular. The scope, we had to sort of be very conscious of the scope of this harmonized layer. So it's really aimed at the AR7 fast track deadlines. And it's about delivering a data request that serves the purpose of the AR7 fast track. This is quite a large activity, and by harmonization we mean balancing many different sort of tensions around serving out the needs of a very diverse CMIP user community, and also being conscious of resource limitations and just the very large cost that CMIP production takes on modeling centers and data infrastructure. And so that's the kind of the big bulky section. That's the complex mapping. We did this through a large consultation process, which we'll talk about, and as mentioned briefly here. But it's really about serving the AR7 fast track. The unharmonized layer, this third one, is kind of our forward plan. It's something that we conceived of to roll between sort of the primary CMIP7 phase and the CMIP8 phase. We're conscious that as CMIP moves into more of a rolling sort of style, where MIPs and new experiments will be lifted and raised and requested sort of more continuously, and we wanted to be able to sort of incorporate that in, but we haven't done a lot of work there yet. We've really focused on delivering the AR7 fast track deadline. Let's go on. I've got a bit more detail here just to kind of make it clear what I'm sort of talking about by these. When the core set of variables were devised via the baseline climate variables paper, which was led by Martin Jukes. It was initiated by the WCRP a couple of years ago, and is now almost close to publication. So that's where that was sort of created via. The harmonized layer has been devised by the thematic author process. Beck, do you just mind just muting yourself maybe? I can hear a lot of clicking in. So the harmonized layer we've devised by a thematic author team process, which you may have heard of. We'll go through that in a little bit more process later. But we've had sort of 2 different processes to create these 2 different layers. Let's go next slide. So the BCV paper, the top one, it's currently undergoing revision on EGU Sphere, and it's very close to publication on GMD, which is super exciting. With the harmonized layer, we released basically released the first version last Friday. So that's what we're talking about here. That's really the primary focus of this session, is to communicate largely this harmonized layer, which builds on top of that core. Let's go to the next slide. And just to be clear of how you can actually access this, the top two sections are accessible via the Airtable and via the GitHub Python package that we'll both talk about today. While the unharmonized layer, I just want to be clear, is not yet implemented. That's future work. That's sort of us conceiving of what needs to be done in the future. Let's go next slide. So to have a look more broadly at the data request structure, one of the primary key items that we've introduced into this cycle of the data request, so this is new, is the idea of an opportunity. In CMIP6, there was a lot of mapping done between variables and experiments based on scientific objectives, but these scientific objectives were not very clear in the data request. They weren't really used as sort of in the way that we've used it here. So we've conceived of these opportunities, which are use cases, objectives, designed to support community decision-making and understanding of priorities and data usage. So what the core idea of these opportunities are is to identify the scientific requirements of the data request. We started off by having a large amount of opportunities proposed so that we could understand what we actually are aiming to achieve with the data request. We're not just producing data for the sake of producing data, we're producing data for the sake of producing science. And so we want to know what that science is. What are the requirements of the science? What are the objectives? And then working down from the objectives down into what are the experiments and the variables that are required to fulfill those scientific requirements and those scientific goals. And so these opportunities initially were used to create the data request. They were used by the thematic author process, which I'll talk about, to create a robust data request that really serves the science first. And then the secondary purpose is to communicate those objectives, primarily to the modeling centers, to support modeling centers be able to make those decisions about what data are they going to produce, what kind of science do each modeling center want to support. This is really about, at that point, sort of as of release, now that the data request is mostly built, it's really about communicating. It's about the why these experiments with these variables, why these variables are high and these variables are low priority, whereas and sort of justification for all of that, so that modeling centers, when they're making resource decisions, can be a lot more informed about what science they will be supporting or not supporting by producing certain variables or running certain experiments, which has been very successful process to go through. It's really great. Let's go to the next slide. So the way that this actually flows down into the data request, down to actual variables. So these opportunities, these are mapped down to variable groups and experiment groups, which are then just non-exclusive groups of variables and experiments. So the opportunities are the connection point between experiments and variables. We group them into variable groups and experiment groups just to make the sort of the granularity of the information a bit more accessible, so that one opportunity doesn't have 1,000 variables that you got to dig through. Instead it's got 7 variable groups and 1,000 variables, so that there's some grouping, some logical sense building as well, so that you don't have to necessarily dig through 1,000 variables to understand what it's requesting. It's really about that sort of synthesizing the information so that it's more accessible and more sort of easily able to be digested by the different users of the data request. Let's go forward. So to create these harmonized variables, this harmonized layer, we've done it through a process that we've called, well, the process is the harmonization. So that's what I'm going to talk about first. So by harmonization, it's really about devising a controlled list of high priority variables. And by controlled, I mean through a controlled process. But that controlled process is the thematic author process, which has been facilitated by the IPO and the data request task team. And so it's not an uncontrolled process where we've just got kind of maybe MIPs throwing variables at us, just expecting that we just map them onto experiments and then be done. It's about creating a process of conversation so that we can have a really tightly controlled list of key variables. We don't want the data request to just be a hodgepodge, because that's likely to be that would produce a data archive that would have a lot of gaps, a lot of issues, a lot of scientific requirements that aren't filled. And so it's about managing the tension between the very large scientific goals and the users of the data request and the users of CMIP data as a whole, which are incredibly broad and have been increasingly broad over CMIP cycles, as you might know, and staying conscious of those resource limitations, not just so we're talking capacity of institutions to actually produce. We're talking infrastructure ability to store all of that data, and then also environmental issues as well. I mean, we don't want to be producing and storing for long times more data than we should be because that's not good on the environment as far as CO2 emissions go. So that's also a concern. So that's what we mean by this harmonization process. We of course can't do that on our own. This is a community-driven effort, and we're really, really conscious from the very get-go that we're not the decision makers here as far as what variables are request. We're just here to design the process and facilitate the process, build the tools, and then deliver the product. Whereas it's the community that really need to create the data request and build the content of the data request. So to do that, on the next slide, we initiated about a year ago, just next slide if you can, Beth. So we've created a process of really wide consultation. It's quite controlled consultation where we've had a small group of people, a relatively small group of people engaged in the thematic author teams. So these were call outs for 5 different teams based on sort of broad themes and realms. Atmosphere, Earth system, which is a bit all-encompassing, impact and adaptation, focusing on those application and services kind of focus, land and land ice, and ocean and sea ice. So we put out a public call for team members. We had steering groups for each of these that we invited members to from largely the MIPs and who selected these author teams who've then spent a large amount of this year working on designing the content of the data request, starting from opportunities and working down. This has been a really successful process, and I want to thank everyone who's been involved with that. A bit more information about that on the next slide. So by small group, I mean 106 people, which is a lot to manage, but compared to the scale of the CMIP community itself is very small. But we've had awesome representation, and it's been a really amazing process with these 106 people from 25 countries. And thanks to everyone for contributing. Let's go on. So what's the process we actually went through? Once we had these author teams in place, how have we gone from there to here, to a release? The first step was around opportunity proposals. So we put out a call for opportunities to be suggested. We had some descriptions about what these opportunities should be. We're still kind of working through exactly what we wanted them to be at the time. And it was a really awesome process to see just, the different kind of scientific requirements and different scientific goals that came out of the thematic author teams themselves, but also a wider consultation. So there was opportunities proposed by the wider community, not just those in the thematic teams too. Each opportunity was designated a lead theme, and other themes were also tagged for review if they were relevant to that scientific goal. We also had a cross-thematic working group that was also reviewing every opportunity as well. So there was a lot of reviewing opportunities across the different themes. That was our really first cycle of harmonizing these opportunity proposals. We went from about 80 down to now 48. And there was initial reviews done. We had quite a significant amount. Some rejected because they sort of maybe didn't apply, or they were very similar to other ones. A lot of other ones we merged. There's a lot of merging going on, which is very key to the harmonization process. It was very successful. Following that, once we'd largely settled on the opportunities that we were going to be moving forward through, then we really started going down into the depths of these. So the opportunity proposals included some variable requests as well underneath those, and experiment requests. And so once we'd solidified those opportunities, we really started digging into the details, going down into variable levels, going even further down into variable metadata structures, and all this kind of all that good stuff that you'll find in the Airtable as far as the details go. This process was really massive and a little bit messy, but it was managed through a combination of a bunch of different information management sort of ways that were really successful. We had the Airtable, which we'll talk about a little bit later, where contributors from the thematic teams were directly contributing to the Airtable, so directly providing content into the data request. We had spreadsheet action registers. We had GitHub issues tracking specific items and issues that were still being unpicked and discussed, offline discussions. It was a huge flurry of activity to get to where we are today. To complement this, we've also had public consultations. So we had a really big public consultation following the version 1.0 beta, where we put out a set of spreadsheets that could be collaborated on by MIPs and modelling centres to get some controlled feedback. We're going to be doing that again now as of next week, following this release as well. So we're trying to stay connected with the wider community as much as possible. Very difficult with a community the size of CMIP, of course. Let's go to the next slide. What does our timeline look like? So our public consultation will start very soon in early December, hopefully next week. It'll run till the 17th of January, at which point the public consultation for version 1.0 will close. We'll then work on merging those changes into the data request for a version 1.1 release scheduled for the 30th of January. We'll then do another round of public consultation directly following that 1.1 release, which will flow until the end, towards the end of March. So that'll be about a month and a half of public consultation, at which point we'll then freeze the data request, make those changes, and release version 1.2, which will be our final major release at the end of March. So that's what we're really working towards here, is we're working towards version 1.2 via version 1.1 on this kind of time frame. Let's go to the next slide. I think this is my last slide. So just a few stats from the version 1.0 release. We've got 48 opportunities, which is a really awesome number of spread of the scientific opportunities and scientific goals of CMIP. It was really awesome to see sort of the spread of intention across these opportunities. In those 48 opportunities, we've had 1,813 variables requested. This is slightly reduced from CMIP6, which was one of our goals, was to reduce the data request in scope. Not in scientific scope, but in just in size. And so we've been successful in that, bringing it under 2,000 variables. We've had 354 new variables created, which is complemented by 188 new physical parameters, which are sort of structureless parameters. And we've got 182 variable groups connected to those 48 opportunities, which is awesome. Let's go next slide. Hurrah. If you've got any questions, raise your hands. Happy to take any questions based on the content that I've just presented. We've also got a slider if you want to put questions in there where you can be a little bit less anonymous because this is recorded. So I'm happy to take any questions now if anyone has, or otherwise we're ready to move on to Martin.
Have we got any questions for Chloe?
Anything in the slider?
Nothing in the Slido right now. Also, if you do think of questions sort of in a little bit, if you pop it in the Slido, we'll make sure to answer it after the session if we don't get to it now. We've got a hand up from Christian. Christian?
Yeah. Hi, thanks for the presentation. I have a question regarding input for Cortex. So is this part of the core or of the harmonized part of the data request?
Yeah, it's part of the harmonized. So Cortex came through the impacts and adaptation theme, largely where we were focused on providing data for downscaling purposes. So one of our opportunities is primarily around Cortex and downscaling. So we made a lot of intention for that. The core is not specific to any particular use case. It's really all purpose. And so a specific use case like Cortex went through the opportunities.
And the harmonized will be provided for the fast track experiments, more or less.
Yes. Yeah, the current goal is just focusing on the fast track experiments. We have some longer term plans to broaden that out to different kinds of experiments outside the fast track. But considering the timelines here, we've got a strong delivery requirement.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Got another question from Thomas.
Yeah, I've two questions actually. One is before we had the command line tool DRQ. When I was looking, I think it was not the 1.0 release, but a bit earlier. I could not find it, and yeah, I was wondering if this kind of feature or in a Python form will be there again.
Yep. Yeah. I'll hit pause on your question until we get to the end of the presentation, because by the time we get to the end, that will absolutely be answered. So thumbs up for that. Yes, there's definitely a Python interface to interact with the data request. James will talk about that a bit more.
Okay, and then the second question is, like we now have to deal with the mapping from CMIP6 variables to CMIP6 plus. We will also have to map variables between CMIP6 and CMIP7.
Yep.
Is there the same kind of? I now get this mapping from a certain wiki for the CMIP6, CMIP6 plus. Is there this mapping, so a long table in any form? Is it available already for CMIP6, CMIP7?
Yeah, so a lot of the content, most of the content in the data request is not changed from CMIP6. So a lot of the variables, the large majority of the variables have stayed the same. There's been some slight changes. We're working within, James is working in the Python package to, I believe, create some sort of comparisons between CMIP6 and CMIP7 so that changes in variables specifically can be very easily tracked. I'll probably leave that one for James to answer, who will be a lot more across that question. We did have a discussion about it yesterday, so it's definitely on our radar, if not currently supported.
Yeah, because for modeling centers, yeah, we have to, of course, we have to identify our own model variables against the CMIP list, and this is actually something which is needed in a very early stage, because
absolutely
only then you can go forward. So
yeah, and it can be quite time consuming. Absolutely, yeah, for sure. We're very conscious of that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks very much. I don't see any other hands right now, so perhaps we will thank Chloe for her excellent presentation and move over to Martin, who will present the next set of slides for us.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between CMIP6 and CMIP7 from a range of different perspectives, starting off with a bit about the organization. Going back to CMIP5, the standard output list was basically part of Carl's support for CMIP. In CMIP6, that was diversified a bit, or I took on the data requests. The input then came from the endorsed MIPs. In CMIP7, we got a much broader organization, which Douglas talked a little bit about, with author teams and steering groups, bringing in a wide range of people to actively take part in the harmonization process. And this is really about getting more people involved in harmonization and getting more people involved in the discussion about the overall structure of the data request. And I should also say that the CMIP IPO is also new in CMIP7, and they've played a great role in enhancing the communication, which is a big part of the data request effort. In terms of the process, in CMIP6, we took input via Excel templates. We did let people request complete CMOR tables, which had some undesirable consequences. Consolidation was largely myself, supported by Carl and a few other people. There was some volume estimation going on to encourage some constraint on what people asked for. Some of the initial plans were dropped. We allowed people to put a different priority on every variable. It actually caused a lot of confusion. It's quite a simple process, but and we had over 30 version releases with ad hoc timing for something that we really wanted to change. CMIP7, we've gone to an open consultation with no MIP endorsement. We've tried to ensure that each variable is justified rather than having requested upon in blocks. Thematic author teams to do consolidation, which brings a lot of people with very varied or wide-ranging knowledge across the whole area of climate science into that process. And that, as Claudia said, has been very successful. Within those teams, we've had extensive discussion of resource implications. It's a very complex discussion, but that has been successful in creating a more coherent and transparent view of what's going on. Priorities are assigned to groups of variables, so there's much less granularity, which should make it easier for people to access the information. And we have 3 planned releases, of which this is the version 1.0 release. Next slide, please. In terms of what was in the database, what was in the release, in CMIP6, we have the database in an XML file, HTML web pages to allow people to browse it, and a Python library. This is the data rec.py. Now we have a cloud-hosted database in Airtable and exports to JSON files. And the Python library is replaced by community GitHub repo, which James will talk about in more detail. So there's an equivalence in services there, not a direct translation of individual artifacts. Next slide, please. As for the content in CMIP6, we had 25 MIPs, 245 variable groups, over 2,000 CMOR variables, and then over 6,000 prioritized variables, because different MIPs had different priorities for each variable. In CMIP7, we consolidated around 5 themes and 48 opportunities. And one important difference here is the opportunities have been harmonized very carefully. So there's been a lot of discussion about overlaps and consolidation of opportunities, as Chloe described. So these provide, we hope, a clear overview of the range of scientific issues that the community want to address with CMIP. Scientific and impact issues. So there's a lot of impacts working there. 182 variable groups, each carrying different priorities, and just over 1,800 variables, a slight reduction in the overall number of variables. Next slide, please. CMIP6, we had priorities 1 to 3, priorities applied to each variable. Over 50% in priority 1, which did a little bit defeat the purpose of the prioritization, given that many modeling groups can't do as much as 50% of the request. And a high degree of flexibility for MIPs, which led to quite a complex picture that data producers. In CMIP7, we have priorities set to core, high, medium, and low, where core just applies to the baseline climate variables, which is the 135 variables. Or I should say there are 132 in the 1.0 release, but in parallel, the baseline climate variable list has been going through public review in GMD, and it's been extended to 135, so that'll come into the 1.1 release. We've been quite inflexible about the structure of the data request and how people apply priorities, which has forced the author teams to make difficult choices, but it's kept a clean structure for data profiles. Next slide, please. Questions?
Do we have any questions for Martin? Again, feel free to pop your hand up, or you can pop your question in the Slido as well. There's a link in the chat to access that Slido. Not seeing any hands at the moment. Again, you can always pop a question in Slido and we can come back to it towards the end of the session if you think of it during the next talk. So with that, we'll hand over to James, who's going to talk a little bit about the software package that will be available and is available with the data request.
Okay, thanks, Beth. So I'll just say a few brief words about the software. So if you were to go to the version 1.0 release page, which a screenshot is shown here. This was, of course, in the email circulated by the IPO. It says that there are two components of the data request that you can access: the online database, listed in Airtable, as Martin and Chloe had mentioned, and then you can also interact with the data request content using the software package posted on GitHub. So next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of the front page of that, the URL at the top. So the purpose of this software is to allow users to interact with the content, such as to produce lists of the variables requested for each experiment, information about the requested variables, their metadata, and generally allow you to query and use the information in the data request. Of course, it's the same underlying information that's contained in the Airtable database. This just provides an alternate means of interacting with it. For example, to support modeler workflows in data production. Next slide, please. So on that front page of the software repo, the README contains a quick start. It should be, we hope, pretty straightforward to try out the software. You simply clone the repository, create the Conda environment for which the environment file is provided, and then you can run the example script or equivalently use the command line interface. Example is shown at the bottom. And we will soon make pip installer available for this package, but it's not, it doesn't have one yet. Next slide, please. So if you were to run this command shown at the top, so this is the command line interface, you see it specifies the version of the data request, names the output file, and a flag called all opportunities. It produces a JSON file that lists the variables requested for each experiment, for every experiment that's been requested from the opportunities. And these variables are categorized by priority. So in the example of this file, so an example of it is provided in the repo. But you could create it yourself by running the software too. You can see the beginning of a list of variables there under the core priority. Now, if one were to run this instead of putting all opportunities, instead just include the opportunity baseline variables, say, then you would get the same list of baseline variables for every experiment, because, as Chloe said, that same core group of 135 variables is requested from all experiments. However, once you start to include other opportunities, then it becomes more complicated. That's the, I think as Chloe said, the bulkier harmonized layer of the data request, where now the variables requested can vary by experiment depending on what opportunities you choose to support. So in this example, this is the list you would get. Of course, it's an extremely long list, which can't be shown on the screen here, but the list you get is what you would be requested to produce if your modeling center chose to support all the opportunities in the data request. Of course, due to resource restrictions, you may choose to support only a limited set of opportunities. In that case, you would specify the opportunities you're supporting as input to this script, and it would produce the variables requested for each experiment in order to support that subset of opportunities. Next slide, please. Also provided is a flat list giving the metadata for each variable, which is shown here in the format used in the CMIP7 CMOR tables. So in the example file on the previous slide, variables were identified by their names, such as, for example, amon.taz or 3hour.clt. These are the CMIP6 era names. These may not be the final names used in the data request For now, we're using the CMIP6 equivalents, but in any case, if they change, a mapping will be provided so that you can, if you know what CMIP6 variable you produce, and this is, I think, addresses the question that was raised earlier, you will be able to find out what is the equivalent variable, if there is one, in the CMIP7 request. This file, in turn, for those variables, tells you what the metadata characteristics are. And we do not have Seymour tables yet, because this will depend on some decisions to be made in further development of Seymour. However, to get started as an interim solution, this flat list provides the metadata of the variables. And again, all this information is accessible via the Airtable interface, but this provides an alternate means of viewing it that is more similar to the Seymour tables, if that is your preference to see it this way. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned a couple of times, Airtable is the primary source of the data request information, but through the software, there is a complementary view of this information. Okay, Seymour tables are not yet provided, but variable metadata is provided in a flat list, and a function to distill differences, if any, from the CMIP6 variables, that is updates if things, if a particular variable has had something changed in its metadata since CMIP6. That will be provided soon. There is already a flag in Airtable for some of those differences, but there will also be a software means to examine them. And this software is intended to be open source. Community contributions are very welcome. Two ways to provide feedback are to open an issue if there's a specific thing you would like to see in the software, or of course, if you find a bug, please open a GitHub issue. This would include, for example, if there's some function from the DirectPy CMIP6 package, some specific function, say, you would like implemented because you need it for your workflow, an issue would be the ideal place to raise that. For more general questions, concerns, discussions, we also have a GitHub discussion forum. The link is given there at the bottom. So that's it. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, be happy to try and answer them.
If anyone's got questions for James, as with the others, please feel free to pop your hand up or write it in the Slido. So we've just got one question in from the Slido that I'll ask first. Is the information which variable is requested by which experiment also provided in one of the columns in the Airtable? And if not, why not?
So if you meaning by variable, which experiments it's requested from? Like in the variables table, is that?
Yeah, so the information on which variables are requested by which experiments.
Well, that would depend on the opportunities supported.
Yeah, so I think we did discuss having that for the whole list, but the selection by opportunities is not easy to implement in Airtable.
Yeah.
Because you have to construct a list of which 48 opportunities you're supporting, and this is just a little bit too much to put into the cloud database, but it can be done in the software.
If your question is on the assumption you're doing all opportunities, that is available in the Airtable though. If you want to view it by experiment, you would go to the experiments tab of the Airtable, and then it's got all the variables that are requested for that experiment if you were to do every opportunity. We've also got a question from Thomas.
Yes, thank you. Very nice that we transform from Excel files to JSON. That's really much better. I see that now the tool, the command line tool we can use is this export drag lists JSON.py. I wondered, maybe I missed it, if there is also just a Python library which I can just load, and then I can just iterate myself in an own Python program. I can iterate over all this information, so I can directly load all this information. Yeah, so that's the question.
Yeah, so there is an example workflow that you could look at. I'm not sure if that workflow, so that's in the scripts directory. It's just called workflow example.py. I'm not sure if that has the level of granularity you need, but there are a couple other scripts in the repo that if it doesn't, there are a couple other scripts that might, which I can point you to. So I mean, I could look at one now. It might be a little too much detail for this meeting. It might be easier to iterate offline about that. So in the, I think the best way for you to look at the workflow example script and see if that satisfies what you're asking for. And if it doesn't, I think the best thing would be to open an issue and ask for the level of granularity that you're seeking. It may be, do you understand what I'm saying? It may be, what you're asking for might be buried a little deeper in the software, but it is possible to get it. I'm just not sure what level you're after. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, just say quickly.
Yeah.
I think this is a change. I mean, the Python package was a library before, was kind of a maintained interface for people to interact with the interface. Now we're asking people to interact more with the repository as a sort of open community resource.
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it. Here, I could maybe give a quick concrete example. So if you wanted to say, get the metadata on variables, there is a script in there, which will basically, it creates Python objects that correspond to the tables in Airtable, and then follows links through those objects, just like you would if you were to manually point click through the links on Airtable, but it just does it in a programmatic way, iterates over all the necessary tables and links to get out all the metadata on the variables. So you could do that kind of thing, like have Python objects that correspond to the things that you see in Airtable.
I see, Marie-Pierre, you also have your hand up. So Marie-Pierre is co-leading this development work with James. Did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I had a comment about, well, Thomas' request, just to say a general comment that this kind of expression of needs from the modeling centers and, well, the way they expect the data request to be queried and, well, plugged in a programmatic way in their software or just for discovering is very, very interesting for us to have these feedbacks and to improve, well, the example we give. You know, so far, well, the workflow example James talked about is a simple one. There's many other functionalities that are in the software GitHub repository and not yet implemented. As example, you know, there's a lot of way you can cross the information and output it in different ordered dictionaries, depending, you know, about crossing opportunities, experiments, and variable groups, and so on. So there's much other function developed, but not yet well provided in examples. So they well the main in further development stage we aim to provide more example like a notebook format in order to to have something more user friendly and interactive. And yes, and anyway, the main point is, if you have specific needs or way you prefer, you want the interaction with the software to be and output format and so on, then just tell us in GitHub issues, and we'll be happy to well, to implement or even implement in a collaborative way if you want.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely. Thanks, Marie-Pierre. Just to add a quick additional comment to that, like if you have a kind of idea of how you want to parse through this information, even to just provide say like a pseudocode kind of example, we could then probably reply by indicating how that will be implemented using the tools in this package. And it would be really helpful, as Marie-Pierre said, to know what that would help guide us in the types of examples we provide. Because, yeah, we are a relatively small group here, so that feedback from modeling centers is really important.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see any other hands or questions in the Slido for now, so we'll move on. But as before, feel free to pop questions in the Slido if you think of them in the interim. We've just got 1 or 2 more slides before we wrap up this morning. So the first one here is just a sort of a question from us to you. So throughout this whole process, one of the guiding principles really is to engage with the community and as wide a community as possible. And the way we've kind of done that so far is through multiple different approaches. And we've done that to try and kind of satisfy different requirements which come from different communities, different modelling centres and everyone. So, for example, we've had drop-ins like today, and we've had similar events before. With the releases, we've circulated feedback sheets, so those can be shared within communities to provide sort of a consolidated response, whether that's from a MIP or from a modelling centre. We've had comment forms for people to provide technical errors with variables. We've got the online viewer of the data request where people can sort of browse and pass the content themselves in a slightly more user-friendly format sometimes. We've also got the software that James has talked through today. But we really want to know if this is working and if there are other options we could do that would work better for any of your communities. So just some of the plans that we've got, we plan to mostly continue the same sort of methods we've been using so far, likely do drop-ins around the releases of the data request versions. We'll keep open those comment forms for technical fixes. We will do updated spreadsheet content with each release, but whilst keeping the spreadsheet format the same. And in addition, we also have planned a particular focus meeting for our impacts and adaptation theme to engage with modelling centres, as those two communities haven't always previously been as directly connected. But our question is really, is there anything else you want to see, or is there anything different that you want us to change? We really are all open ears to hearing it. So please, if you have any ideas, as with before, pop your hand up or put a question in the Slido, and we're happy to chat. This is also a chance to ask any questions that you may have had from earlier in the session that you haven't yet had a chance to ask. And if we're not getting anything, you can always send us your thoughts afterwards by email. We're always happy to hear it at any time. So we just have a last couple of, again, questions from us to you. And I will hand over to Martin for this, but please, for this, you will need to go to the Slido, as we have a couple of polls that we would like you to answer. So over to you, Martin.
Yeah, so the idea of these questions was to just get a general idea of how our approach is working for you. As we've heard in the presentations, there's quite a lot of complex discussions going on. Quite a lot of choices and decisions have been made on the basis of feedback, and we just want to check a little bit how this is landing. So one thing we've been discussing is time slices, which are specified for some high volume variables in order to avoid the high resource use, which would be the consequence of asking for them for the whole experiment. But in some cases, appears this might not be very useful. So we just sort of ask, are you planning to support time slices in your data production workflow? That means, is it really useful to you when we ask for data from a limited time slice? And there's a range of options to that, if we can see the Slido.
Yeah. There you go.
So yeah, I'll give you little bit of time to get there. This does involve quite a lot of discussion among the author teams about how to define these time slices. Just understand a bit more how this information gets used.
I think I might have sent it.
Is anybody trying to access Slido and finding problems?
Okay. Let's see. I think it's a I think people are voting, it's just not showing, I'm afraid. Yeah. It sounds like we do have your responses, we just can't present them. Hopefully for another poll it might work.
Oh yeah, so we have 9 responses. Okay, thank you. So the next question, so yeah, we're going to leave this open,
yeah,
and consolidate with responses from the other launch event, which was held about 14 hours ago. So, will you be selective about the opportunities you support? As we've said, a lot of effort has gone into defining these opportunities clearly, so we can say exactly why data is needed for specific science or impacts objectives. We know that some data centers will, data producers will just look at the whole list. And we just want to find out, are you going to use these opportunities to be selective to reduce the amount of requested data that you have to look at?
Yeah, so 86 say yes currently. 86% say yes.
Okay, that's good. Okay, good. That's nice. Then we'll hope for a little bit more feedback, I guess, in the next consultation round about whether the opportunities are clearly expressed. But let's for now move on. Do you have a cutoff for requiring the data request? And we're asking you to provide sort of time frame and your modelling centre name. So we know that different modelling centres have different deadlines for many reasons, because of the time it takes to run their model, because of the workflow they like to build around it, the computing and staff resources available. So if we could just get an idea of when the cutoffs are, so that we can do our best to get the right information available. Bearing in mind we're just providing a small number of leases, so it'll be useful information for us.
It's fed between March and mid 2025.
Okay, that's interesting.
Please include your modelling centre name if possible.
But that's interesting. So when we asked this question about 6 or 7 months ago, there were more people wanting to start in January. So it's usually a slight split, which is not particularly surprising. It's useful to have that clarified.
Sounds like our timelines will work.
Yeah. And the final question, as we've said, we now have this sort of expanded group of people engaged, more than 100 people who are engaged, actively engaged in the data request. And we just want to get an idea of whether the people like yourselves who are now interested in implementing it have direct contact with any of these people it's quite likely there is somebody in your institution, but it might not be somebody you know. So we're asking, do you know somebody who is in the data request task team or an author group?
Majority say yes.
75% say yes.
Yeah. Okay.
If you are someone that's answered no and you ever want to get in touch, feel free to always just contact the CMIP IPO. Our email address is available on our website and many other resources, and we can put you in touch with the person that you will need. Yeah. As you see, there's good geographical coverage. When selecting the authors, we did take into account institutions. So 100 authors does mean close to 100 institutions. So there's good spread around the world. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We really appreciate all of the input, the questions, and the discussions. We'll combine it with the things that came up in the session we had yesterday, and we will share the slides and recording, and also the Slido poll. So if you didn't get a chance to fill in today, you can always fill in after the session.
And all the questions and answers will go up on the website FAQ that you can access at any time.
Yeah. So again, thank you all so much. And the details about the data request release with all of the links and things that have been mentioned today can be found on our website. It's currently the top news item under version 1.0 now available. So yeah, thank you again, and we will see you all soon.